The restaurant was filled with lights, laughter, and arrogant looks. In the middle of the room, the young, beautiful blonde waitress just wanted lunch after an exhausting day at work. But, realizing she didn't have enough money to pay for the meal, the waiter called the manager, who didn't miss the opportunity to humiliate her in front of everyone. Her voice echoed through the room. "This is no place for people like you." The customers laughed, complicit in the cruelty, while the blonde head down felt her heart shatter. She left silently, expelled as if she were a criminal. But no one imagined that that same young woman, hours later, would return not as a customer, but as the true owner of the restaurant. Night fell, and the restaurant was once again buzzing with voices and music. Suddenly the front door opened. All eyes turned to the young blonde, the same one who had been chased away hours earlier. But something was different. Her posture was firm, her eyes shining with dignity. Beside her walked an elderly man of respectable presence, whom many recognized immediately, the true owner of the restaurant chain. The murmur grew like wildfire. The millionaire host, who had watched her expulsion with contempt, paled. The young woman's godfather raised his voice. "Today you will learn a lesson you will never forget." The room held its breath. The turnaround no one could have imagined was about to begin. If you felt the power of this story in these first moments, imagine what's yet to come. Every detail holds a twist. Every silence conceals a weight. Take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel so you can journey together to the end of this narrative where destiny always reveals its face. The city's most famous restaurant was known for its sophistication: marble tables, crystal glasses, impeccably uniformed waiters, and a menu that resembled a luxury jewel rather than a simple meal. People didn't go just to eat. They went to be seen, to show off their expensive attire, and prove they belonged to a circle unattainable for most. That afternoon, among businessmen, ladies in glittering jewelry, and wealthy young men showing off their expensive watches, a young blonde woman entered discreetly. Her beauty drew attention, but her simple maid's uniform betrayed her origins. Her loose hair fell over her shoulders, her clear eyes were weary, and her posture revealed someone who was there more out of necessity than vanity. She had saved up for weeks so she could, for the first time, sit in a place she had always seen from the outside. She sat down at a corner table, simply trying not to attract attention. She ordered only a modest dish and a glass of water. As she waited, she took in the details. The chandeliers reflecting golden light, the diners' affected laughter, the waiters gliding through the room with measured steps. It was as if she had entered another world, one in which everyone regarded her as an intruder. The dish arrived, and she began to eat in silence. Each bite was a mixture of pleasure and nervousness, knowing that any mistake would be judged. When she finished, she took a deep breath and called the waiter for the check. It was then that everything changed. The waiter, with a leer, slapped the bill on the table with more force than necessary. The young woman opened her purse and began to carefully count the bills. But to her dismay, she realized she was missing a few reais. She tried to explain, saying she could come back the next day to pay the difference. The waiter frowned, crossed his arms, and called the manager. Within seconds, everyone around was paying attention to the scene. The manager, a woman with a rigid posture and a venomous smile, approached. Her voice echoed through the room loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is no place for people like you. If you can't pay, you shouldn't have come in." The young woman froze. Eyes began to turn to her. Some chuckled quietly. Others whispered cruel words. The manager continued, "You thought you could pretend to be one of us? Look at yourself. You're just a little maid trying to live a dream that doesn't belong to you." The laughter grew louder. The millionaire seated at the main table, a regular customer, watched with a look of contempt. He raised his wine glass and toasted with his friends, as if the young woman's suffering were part of the spectacle. The blonde felt her face burn, her eyes watering. She tried to get up and leave discreetly, but the manager, as if wanting to prolong the spectacle, walked her to the door and, with a theatrical gesture, expelled her in front of everyone. "Next time, know your place." The doors closed behind her. The cold of the street enveloped her, and the tears finally fell. But along with the pain, a flame was born within her. She knew this night wasn't over yet. Outside, the street seemed too cold for what she felt inside. Tears fell silently, mingling with the heavy air of humiliation. The young blonde walked slowly along the sidewalk, hearing behind her the echo of laughter still coming from the restaurant. Each step was a weight, each sigh a reminder that, to them, she would never be more than invisible, an intruder who dared to dream. She leaned against a lamppost, took a deep breath and hugged herself, trying to compose herself. The manager's words echoed in her mind like hammer blows. "This is no place for people like you. Know your place." That hurt. More than the lack of money itself. It wasn't just being expelled, it was being reduced to nothing, before an audience that fed on her shame. For a moment she thought about never setting foot in a place like that again. She felt crushed, and the thought of the tray she carried daily to work seemed even heavier. But inside her there was a spark, a voice that said softly, "They will see. They will still see who I am." As she walked, she remembered someone very important in her life, her godfather. The man who had raised her after she lost her parents, the only one who believed in her worth when everyone else treated her like a shadow. Her godfather was discreet, but he had built a silent empire. Few knew it, but he was the true owner of several companies, and among them, the very luxurious restaurant that had humiliated her. She had never spoken of it to anyone. She maintained her simple life and her job as a maid because she believed she needed to learn to earn things through hard work. But now, faced with the humiliation she had suffered, she understood that her silence had reached its limit. The public scorn, the crushing stares, and the laughter that still echoed within her were the last straw. He lifted his head, wiped away his tears, and made a decision. This night wasn't over yet. And when he returned to that restaurant, he would no longer be the humble, shrunken, invisible young woman. He would return with the truth at his side, and all who had scorned her would learn that fate has painful and surprising ways of turning the tables. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, the mood was one of victory for the manager and the millionaire who had toasted the embarrassment. The customers resumed their conversation, but some were still commenting on the scene, laughing as if they had witnessed a cheap spectacle. The manager, proud, walked around the room with firm steps, satisfied with having reaffirmed her authority. The millionaire, between sips of expensive wine, commented, "These kinds of people need to learn that certain places are not for them." His words were accompanied by knowing laughter, but no one there knew that outside a turnaround was brewing. The young woman, now standing on the sidewalk, discreetly dialed her godfather's number. When his voice answered on the other end, firm and caring, she simply said between sobs, "The time has come." The clock in the dining room read a little after 8 o'clock, when life in the restaurant seemed to have returned to normal. Waiters circulated with silver trays, customers chatted loudly, and the manager paraded around the space with a proud smile, as if she'd served justice by expelling the young blonde. For her, it was just another day of reasserting her power, showing who was in charge and reinforcing who didn't belong there. Outside, however, something different was moving. The blonde remained standing, breathing deeply, more aware with each passing second that this night would not end as it began. Shortly after the call, a black car pulled up in front of her. The tinted windows slowly lowered, revealing a face marked by time, but firm and imposing. It was the godfather. He watched her for a few seconds, recognizing in her tearful gaze the pain of humiliation, but also the flame of rising indignation. "Tell me what happened," he said in a deep voice. She recounted every detail: the customer's disdain, the muffled laughter, the manager's cruelty, the millionaire's toast. Her words came out haltingly, but her firmness grew with each sentence. The godfather listened in silence, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "I've always let you live your life as you saw fit," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "I've always admired your courage in choosing to work, in making it on your own. But there's a line no one has the right to cross. And today, they crossed it." The blonde took a deep breath, and for the first time since the humiliation, she felt the weight lift. The godfather opened the car door and held out his hand. Let's show them who really owns this place. Back at the restaurant, the evening continued with soft music and the clinking of cutlery. The millionaire laughed loudly with his friends, telling jokes about people who don't know their place. The manager accompanied him, pleased to have served as an instrument in this cruel spectacle. None of them knew that fate was already knocking at their door. When the entrance opened, again all eyes turned. The young blonde entered, this time with her posture erect, her eyes shining, and the presence of someone who no longer carried shame, but authority. Behind her walked the best man. Some guests recognized him immediately and stood in respect. The murmur began to grow like a suppressed thunder. The manager frowned in surprise. She took a few steps toward them, trying to make sense of the scene. "You again," she said harshly. "I already told you there's no place for you. Here." But before he could continue, the godfather raised his hand. His voice echoed firmly through the hall. "The restaurant does have a place, yes, and it belongs to her." The impact was immediate. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The pale-faced millionaire slowly rose from his chair, unable to believe what he was hearing. Customers glanced at each other, and the buzz began to spread. Like this? Does it belong to her? That is true. And in that moment, everyone understood that the night was about to turn upside down. The silence that fell over the room after the godfather's words was almost suffocating. Glasses hung in the air, cutlery halfway to their mouths, looks that had been scornful just minutes before were now filled with astonishment. The manager, who moments before had been striding proudly through the restaurant, paled. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The millionaire, seated at his prominent table, stood up abruptly, his eyes wide as if he had just witnessed an earthquake. "Is this some kind of joke?" he said, trying to regain his tone of authority. This girl? The owner here?" His nervous laughter echoed through the room, but no one joined in. The godfather stood firm, his hand resting on his goddaughter's shoulder in a gesture of protection and pride. "No, it's not a joke," he replied in a deep voice, clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "I am the true owner of this chain, and as of today, this restaurant officially passes to her." The impact was devastating. The room erupted in murmurs. Some women clapped their hands over their mouths, men frowned in disbelief. The millionaire, feeling his control slipping, tried to laugh again, but his voice sounded increasingly fragile. The manager, still stunned, took a step forward. This is impossible. This girl, she has nothing, she's nobody." The blonde finally looked up. Her blue eyes, once teary, now shone with the firmness of someone no longer ashamed. "I am more than you wanted to believe," she said, her voice choked but firm. "And today you will learn that humiliating someone can cost you dearly." The best man took some documents from his jacket and handed them to the maitre d', asking him to show them to the audience. Official signed papers proving the transfer of ownership. With each page shown, the silence grew deeper. There was no denying it anymore. The millionaire, red with rage, slammed his hand on the table. "No! I won't accept this!" He shouted, spitting the words out. But the effect was pathetic. The guests looked at him with contempt. His arrogance, which had so often been applauded, now seemed ridiculous. The manager, now at a loss for a way out, retreated. Her face burned, and the words that had once echoed with authority now died in her throat. Everyone who had laughed with her minutes before now watched her like embarrassed accomplices. The young woman, her heart racing but steady, took a deep breath. He looked around, and for the first time didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, not as a target of humiliation, but as someone who finally had her voice back. And in that instant, everyone knew. Fate was just beginning to turn the tide. The room was filled with a heavy silence at the revelation. The godfather had already made it clear to everyone that the restaurant now belonged to the young blonde. But given the humiliation she had suffered hours earlier, the manager and the millionaire would not accept defeat so easily. The manager, still trembling, took a few steps forward, trying to regain her air of authority. "This is a mistake, it has to be," she said, her voice breaking. "This girl has no training, no class, no bearing to run a place like this. The restaurant will lose its prestige if it's handed over to her. The murmur returned to the tables. Customers whispered among themselves, some surprised, others uncomfortable. The millionaire, taking advantage of the opportunity, rose from his chair. With a cold smile, "He's right, my friends," he said, pointing to his godfather. "This man may have money, but he's clearly lost his mind. Putting a simple maid in charge of such an important business? Can you imagine the disaster that would be?" Some guests chuckled quietly, others nodded. It seemed as if arrogance had found a foothold again, and the blonde felt her heart skip a beat. The memory of the humiliation came back like a wave. The laughter, the looks of contempt, the door being slammed in her face. But this time there were no tears. There was indignation. The godfather remained silent, as if he wanted her to have the chance to answer. The young woman lifted her chin and walked to the center of the room. Her gaze traveled over each face, until she found the manager's cold eyes and the millionaire's venomous smile. "When I walked in here today, I walked in as an ordinary person, just wanting to have a meal in peace." His voice was firm, yet gentle. "But you treated me like trash because you believed a person's worth lies in the money they carry in their pocket." The manager tried to interrupt, but the blonde raised her hand, asking for silence. "Well, know this. It's not money that builds an empire. It's character. And what I saw here today was proof that character is what you lack." Silence fell immediately. The millionaire's smile faded, and the manager's face flushed. Some guests lowered their eyes in embarrassment, remembering their own laughter during the expulsion scene. "This restaurant," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "will continue to be a place of luxury, yes, but it will also be a place of respect. No customer, no employee will ever be humiliated within these walls." The godfather, moved, smiled discreetly. The audience murmured in agreement. The manager stepped back, swallowing hard. The millionaire, realizing the turnaround was complete, clenched his fists and sat back down, helpless. The humiliation that had fallen on her shoulders hours earlier now fell upon the true culprits, and the entire room knew nothing would ever be the same again. The entire room seemed to have awakened from a trance. Those same tables that hours earlier had vibrated with laughter and applause at the blonde's humiliation were now gripped by an awkward silence. The young woman's firm speech echoed in the ears of every guest, and no one could pretend they hadn't witnessed the cruelty. A customer slowly stood up. He was an elegant, grey-haired man, known for being an influential figure in the city. He adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and said in a clear voice, "Today, we all saw the truth. This girl was humiliated before our eyes, and instead of taking action, we laughed. I'm ashamed of that." The murmur grew louder. Others began to nod, some looking away, unable to face the new owner. The manager swallowed hard, her body rigid as stone, while the millionaire tried in vain to regain control of the narrative. "You're all blind," he shouted, spitting out the words. "You're applauding a mistake. This girl doesn't know what she's doing." But this time his voice no longer resonated. The guests no longer followed him. Instead, some began to speak out in support of the young woman. A lady in a blue dress said firmly, "What matters isn't the money she has, but the respect she demands, and that's something you've never known how to give to anyone." All eyes turned to the millionaire, who was speechless. His face, red with anger and frustration, betrayed the fact that his mask of superiority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. The manager, desperate, tried to intervene. "You don't understand. This restaurant has always been a symbol of exclusivity, and if it remains in her hands, it will become a vulgar place." That was the last straw. One of the waiters, who had been silent until then, raised his voice, surprising everyone. "What they did to her was vulgar. We work here every day and see how they treat people. If that's going to change now, I'll be proud to serve in this house." His words were met with timid applause that soon grew louder. The blonde's heart raced. She never imagined seeing employees who once ignored her, customers who once despised her, now publicly defending her. The millionaire gritted his teeth, trying to contain his fury. His wife, pale, avoided everyone's gaze. The manager stood motionless, like a statue about to crumble. The blonde, breathing steadily, thanked him. with a silent look. No grandiose speeches were needed. The spontaneous support was proof that the truth was already clear. Humiliation had turned into recognition. And in that instant, everyone knew the salon no longer belonged to the arrogant millionaire, nor to the cruel manager. It belonged to her, the young woman who hours earlier had been thrown out as if she were nothing, but who was now the true owner. The room was transformed. The timid applause, the murmurs of support, and the gazes now focused on the young blonde showed that the scales had shifted, but the millionaire, unable to accept defeat, made his last desperate attempt to regain power. He raised his wine glass, his eyes flashing with anger, and shouted, "You're all wrong. Do you think she deserves to be here? She's a fraud, an illusion. I know the world, I know the value of things, and her value is zero." The voice echoed through the room, but unlike before, no one joined in. The silence that followed was suffocating. He expected knowing laughter and supportive glances, but he found only indifference and disapproval. The young blonde stood firm. Her blue eyes sparkled, but not with anger, definitely. She took a deep breath and in a calm tone replied, "A person's worth isn't measured by the money they carry. It's measured by the dignity they maintain, even when everyone tries to take it away." The impact was devastating. The guests murmured in agreement. Some clapped discreetly, others nodded silently. With each reaction, the millionaire shrank further, his proud posture crumbling into shame. The manager, trying to support him, stammered, "Don't listen to her. She's just an arrogant girl spoiled by her godfather's money." But the godfather stepped forward, his imposing presence silencing any murmurs to the contrary. His voice sounded like a suppressed thunderclap. "Arrogance is using power to humiliate others. This girl worked, suffered, and still remained humble. That's why I entrust this restaurant to her." The salon erupted in applause. The millionaire paled, and the manager clapped her hand over her mouth, unable to believe what she was seeing. The customers, who had previously laughed at the humiliation, now stood up, supporting the new owner with increasingly loud applause. The blonde felt her chest burn with emotion. The tears this time weren't of pain, but of silent victory. She had faced scorn, mockery, and injustice, but now she stood tall, recognized. The defeated millionaire slammed his glass down on the table. The red liquid spread like blood on the marble, a clear symbol of his downfall. He looked around, but there was no one to support him. Even his wife kept her eyes lowered, refusing to share in his shame. And in that instant, everyone understood. There was nothing more he could do. The power he had believed to be eternal had slipped away forever. The restaurant was no longer a stage for luxury and arrogance. That same room, which hours before had echoed with mocking laughter and cruel comments, now transformed into a silent courtroom. Everyone watched the young blonde with different eyes, no longer as the expelled employee, but as the true owner, heir to the power that had remained hidden for so long. She stood erect, firm, her eyes still teary but full of dignity. With each breath, she regained a piece of the strength they'd tried to take from her. At her side, her godfather stood like a fortress, but the decision to speak or remain silent was hers, alone. And she knew the moment had come. She took a step forward, and the sound of her heels against the marble silenced the entire room. Her voice echoed clearly, without the need for shouting. "Today you laughed at me. You pointed, you mocked, you threw me out like I was nothing. But I learned that it's not money that defines a person's worth, but how they treat others." Some customers lowered their heads in shame. Others watched her with wide eyes, feeling the weight of her words. The manager, motionless, seemed to want to disappear. The millionaire, for his part, was red with anger, but his mouth no longer found the strength to respond. "I could return the same humiliation I suffered to you," she continued, her voice growing firmer with each sentence. "I could expel all those who laughed at me, but I won't, because that would be equaling the cruelty I witnessed here." The silence was heavy, yet liberating. The young woman, previously invisible, was now the light that dominated the room. The godfather smiled discreetly, proudly. The employees exchanged emotional glances, many already holding back tears. For the first time, they realized they could work in a place where respect was more important than ostentation. The millionaire, unable to contain his fury, took a step forward. "This is absurd," he shouted, spitting the words out. "You may have your name on the papers, but you'll never have the respect I have." But the reaction was the opposite of what she expected. The salon erupted in murmurs of disapproval. One client stood up and responded firmly, "Respect? You lost that when you toasted her humiliation." The words pierced the room like arrows. The millionaire recoiled, feeling the ground crumble beneath him. His face flushed, and his arrogance turned to ruin before everyone's eyes. And it was at that moment that everyone understood. There was no more contest. Victory was already sealed, and fate had definitively turned the tide. The room breathed a heavy silence, as if each guest were aware they were witnessing a scene that would forever change the restaurant's prestige. The millionaire, once haughty, now sat silently. His glass dropped on the linen tablecloth, his gaze lost. The manager, motionless, stared at the floor, unable to bear the disapproving glances coming from all directions. In the center of the room, the young blonde stood erect, her head held high, her heart pounding. Her body still trembled, but not from fear, from intensity. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Everyone looked at her, no longer as a target of humiliation, but as the new authority figure. Her godfather, steadfast, watched her with silent pride. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice firm but calm, cutting through the silence like a blade. "When you kicked me out, you said this was no place for people like me, but today this place belongs to me. And I say, this is a place for everyone who comes with respect." The words echoed through the room, and the impact was devastating. Customers who had laughed at her shame now lowered their heads. Others, braver, applauded discreetly. With each clap, her strength grew. There were no cries of revenge, no outbursts of hatred. There was only justice. The millionaire tried to react, but his voice was choked. This can't be happening," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. The blonde turned her face toward him, her blue eyes sparkling. "What you can't do," she said firmly, "is treat people like trash and think you'll never pay for it." The hall erupted in applause, this time loud and unison. The sound reverberated off the marble walls like a collective catharsis. It was as if everyone there needed that moment to release the weight of complicity. The manager, still motionless, let out discreet tears. They weren't tears of true regret, but of fear of facing the ruin of her own arrogance. The millionaire, defeated, hid his face in his hands. The young blonde, now officially the new owner, didn't smile. There was no joy in exposing others' downfalls, only dignity. She walked slowly to the entrance, stopped before the imposing doors, and looked one last time at the guests, who gave her a standing ovation. Let this night serve as a lesson. Humiliating someone is easy. Respect is true power. The doors opened, and streetlights streamed into the dining room as a symbol of renewal. The employee who had been expelled hours earlier had become, in front of everyone, the woman who would change that restaurant forever. And everyone knew no one would ever forget the night fate turned the tables. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe to see more stories like this.